Okay, everyone. So tonight's talk will focus on the researching of Horseshoe Lake within the Shaker Historical Society collection and Austen Walker's process of creating the exhibit Archiving Horseshoe Lake. Just in case you haven't seen the exhibit or want a refresher, I am going to paste the meeting or the exhibit link into the chat in a minute. But we wanted to thank also especially Ohio Humanities and John Barber for making Austin's research experience over the summer possible, and to Dr. Elizabeth Hogue and Dr. Roy Larrick for their insight and expertise for supporting Austin throughout this project. And now, without further ado, I'm going to introduce our speaker. Austen Walker is a first-year PhD student in history at Penn State University. They study the social history of science, medicine, and nature in colonial Latin America. Their current projects examine histories of leprosy, reproduction, and botanical expeditions. They earned a BA in anthropology from the University of Rochester in spring 2022. They are also a graduate of Shaker Schools, so they have loved working with the Shaker Historical Society this past year and the site of many memorable childhood field trips to the Historical Society. Yes, and it was a great pleasure to work with Austen as well. And now I will turn the floor over to you.
Thank you, Krista. Thank you to you and Brianna and everyone at the museum and everyone who contributed to this project. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And jump right into it. So like Krista said, this past summer, I worked as an exhibition assistant and I did a collection survey, which I'm going to talk about what that is, in our Historical Society archives. And then I curated an exhibit about the history of Horseshoe Lake. So for friends from outside Cleveland, or those who aren't very familiar with the history, Horseshoe Lake was dammed in 1852 by the Shakers, who were a religious group kind of descended from the Quakers. And in Northeast Ohio, we had the North Union colony of Shakers that was split into three main families, and the center family dammed Horseshoe Lake in order to power a woolen mill. And since then, it's become a beloved site of recreation, exercise, play, more than 100 years after it stopped being used for industry, its original intended use. Working on a Horseshoe Lake project felt especially pertinent this summer because Horseshoe Lake's future hangs in the balance, because it looks like we're going to be archiving the lake itself and moving on to restoring the original Doan Brook and transforming Horseshoe Lake Park into a new space for all of us to enjoy, helping us protect people's lives and our city. But I wanted to make sure that when we were doing that, we really understood the history of our lake. And so that's where I come in. That's what I spent the summer doing. I was really excited for this project for a few reasons. One is that I just really love archives. I won't go into detail about archive theory, but I really love working with archives and thinking about documents and objects in archival spaces, and not just taking these artifacts of the past as sources of information, but really thinking critically about them. And because of COVID, I had never been in an archive before. All of my history work I've done with online digitized documents. And so this summer was actually my first opportunity to be in an archive in person. And that was really exciting to me because something about like archival documents, it's a tangible thing that connects you to somebody in the past. Like, for example, this summer when I travel to Columbia, to work on my own research projects, I'll be touching documents that people touched in the 16th century, creating history. And that's really cool. And so I was really excited to get into an archive in person this summer. I also have a bit of a background working with museums, especially in museum education. And so I'm really glad that I get to do this talk today. I also led a history walk around Horseshoe Lake over the summer. And so those were opportunities to not just be in the archives and create a digital exhibit, but get to be with community. I also am very interested both anthropologically and historically in the relationship of people to places and to environment. That's something that I study in my doctoral research, and it's something I got to study over the summer. So that was really wonderful. And I'm also a resident of Shaker Heights, or I guess I was from the age of 5 to 17. I went to Shaker schools. I spent a lot of time at Horseshoe Lake Park outside. And so it was really cool to spend the summer learning so many things that I had never known before about the history of my community. Before we jump further into the talk, I want to give a content warning that some of the materials that we'll be looking at from the archives deal with racist rhetoric and images, particularly anti-Black, anti-Indigenous, and anti-Chinese racism. So please take care of yourselves. So I'm going to start by talking about my process for putting together this exhibit. So the very first thing I did was do a collection survey. So basically what that means is I went through everything that we had in our museum's collections to look for things that related to Horseshoe Lake and its history. So we have several file cabinets. We also have flat file cabinets that hold like maps and large flat images. And I will say, I think the hardest part of the entire job was working with those giant maps. It is very hard to maneuver them. It is hard to get them in and out of the cabinet. And it's a little bit of back pain from spending so much time leaning over the map and trying to get a close-up look. But also, that work provided some of the most interesting sources. We also have a collection of scrapbooks that I looked at, some of which are sort of the definition of scrapbook that I had as like a photo album with commentary, but also like binders full of items that community members collected, like letters, newspaper articles, documents that were shared by the Shaker Historical Society or other local organizations. And what's really cool about those scrapbooks is that that's an opportunity to see what someone living, for example, through the Clark Freeway fight in the 1960s, which things they thought were significant enough to put them together into a collection and then donate that collection to the Shaker Historical Society. And so those are really neat sources. While I was doing my collection survey, I was also cataloging. So every time I found something related to Horseshoe Lake, I would catalog the type of object, the title of the document or what the photograph depicted, the date, if there was one, notes. This was the more mundane part, but really enjoyable. Actually, when I was interviewing for this position, Brianna asked me if I was going to be okay with the boring part of history, which is going through page after page after page after page of archival material and not finding anything relevant, and just having to go sometimes for hours without finding something that matters. But then when you do find something that matters, it's so exciting. When I told Brianna was that I'm good with that because I study queer and trans people in colonial Latin America. So all I do is go through pages and pages and pages of material looking for something relevant. Although I actually ended up finding sort of more than I expected to in this collection survey. And as a result, I had a big messy spreadsheet, but luckily Brianna and Krista were there to make it neater. And that's now something that you can access in the exhibit and see sort of the list of items that I found. After I completed my survey and cataloging the items that I found, I digitized a whole lot of documents and photos, everything that I thought was really important or would add a good visual to the exhibit, right? Because I didn't want the exhibit to just be a mountain of text. I wanted the exhibit to focus on the items that we had in our collection. And so I used our scanner that really is not fancy and probably very old, but it felt fancy to me, to scan a whole bunch of things, went to Photoshop to color correct and edit. And then those are the images that you can see now on the exhibit. Before I left and moved to Pennsylvania, I got to do a history walk around Horseshoe Lake, which you can see a photo of on this slide. And that was really great, both because it was nice to be outside and tell the stories that I had learned over the summer in the real places that they had happened. And also because it was nice to get some community feedback and talk about my ideas before putting together the exhibit. So then I actually curated the exhibit. And from the beginning, it was going to be pretty open-ended. I wanted to be guided, like I said, by the materials in the collection, not by a specific story I was trying to tell. It was one of the hardest parts about the exhibit was figuring out how to organize everything because there were so many materials I wanted to share. And I really wanted it to not be just a giant wall of scrolling and scrolling and scrolling through everything that I found interesting. So I had to cut some things out, some things that I'm actually going to show in this talk because I think they're really exciting. But I ended up putting together an exhibit, and because I'm so interested in archives and because this project was so focused on the archives, the collections of the Shaker Historical Society, I ended up sort of leading into that archive theme. Like I said at the beginning of the talk, thinking about not just archiving the letters and photographs in our collection, but archiving spaces like Horseshoe Lake, and preserving that history while also conserving the environment. And that was really cool. And so there is a whole lot in that exhibit that I will not get remotely close to mentioning tonight. And I really hope that you all will follow the link in the chat and go ahead and go through the exhibit because there are so many interesting things to learn. Although my project was quite open-ended and I was willing to be guided by the materials, I had a few hard boundaries, mostly that I was definitely going to talk about Indigenous history and history of the land before colonization. Because Horseshoe Lake was created in 1852 by white settlers, it's really easy to think that, oh, a history of Horseshoe Lake starts then. Or, oh, a history of Horseshoe Lake starts in 1822 when the North Union Shaker Colony was first founded. But the reality is that this land in Northeast Ohio has been inhabited and traveled through and hunted in for around 10,000 years. And so I was not willing to start the story in 1852. This is one of the cool things that I found in that big flat map drawer I was talking about. This is a portion of the Lewis Evans map, which is a map of the British colonies in North America made by the surveyor Lewis Evans in 1755. And the little teepee icons on this map show Indigenous towns, and there are squares that show English forts. And then written commentary, the names of towns or what people of what Indigenous nations are living there, or the geography. And you can see the Cuyahoga River right here, if you can see my mouse circling, and swamp towns nearby, because yes, in fact, Northeast Ohio was extremely swampy, which is part of why Indigenous people mainly traveled through, camped, and hunted here. There were groups that settled and lived in Northeast Ohio, and you can read about that in the exhibit, but for the most part, it was a very transient space. So I think one of the best stories to illustrate my process researching this summer is how I found out about the Hiawatha pageant at Horseshoe Lake. So what happened was I was reading in the archive. George Budinger, who as a child grew up with the Shakers, his family grew up with the Shakers after they were abandoned by his father in the 1880s and the last decade of the colony's existence. He talked a lot with other people who had grown up with the Shakers, trading stories and trying to preserve that history before it died off. So this photo on the left is a photo in a set that were being sort of mailed around amongst some of these former Shakers or friends of Shakers. And everyone was supposed to add captions to them. And underneath this photo, George Budinger wrote, "Does anyone have any information on the Indian encampment at the lake and their presentation of the story of Hiawatha?" And that made me freak out because for a second I was like, hang on, it's like, it was about 1910 that George Budinger was referring to. And there were indigenous people living at Horseshoe Lake or camping at Horseshoe Lake that I didn't know about. And that was really exciting to me. Of course, it was too good to be true. That's not what happened. But the photo on the right here shows where I did find out more about what George Budinger was actually talking about. This is a page from the statement that he gave in 1974 at a symposium on water quality in the Shaker Lakes. It was held at the Natural History Museum when water quality and lack of biodiversity had become a really big problem in the Shaker Lakes. And while George Budinger was sort of documenting what animal life had once been in the lakes, he mentioned this Hiawatha pageant, and he gave me enough information to trace back to Plain Dealer articles explaining what happened. So it turned out that indigenous people were not just living at the lake. A white drama producer from New York City had hired, I don't know if anyone was actually paid, but he had hired about 60 indigenous people from a few different Iroquoian nations living in reservations in upstate New York. And he brought them to Horseshoe Lake to put on a pageant of the legend of Hiawatha. So one thing that was really cool about that walk that I did around Horseshoe Lake was that we could stand right where the audience would have sat, but the audience was sitting at the southern end, on the southern side of the lake, on the Shaker Heights side, and the show was put on in the peninsula where Horseshoe Lake Park is, and then also in canoes. The actors would come out into the lake to put on this show. What's unfortunate is that Hiawatha is the founder of the Iroquois Confederacy. So the legend of Hiawatha dates back to around 1100, the year 1100, and is the Iroquoian origin story, the foundation of the Confederacy. So really important. However, there's also a poem that was written by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow called The Song of Hiawatha that uses the name Hiawatha but is completely unrelated. And based on the Plain Dealer articles about this show, it sounds like that is the story that was put on, because the articles mention a woman starring in the play. And in the poem, The Song of Hiawatha, the character Hiawatha falls in love with a woman, whereas there are really no women at all in the actual legend of Hiawatha, which is sort of hard to think about, the fact that that this producer brought Iroquoian peoples to Shaker Heights to put on a show that was called Hiawatha, but was not in fact about Hiawatha, something they all would have known because it's a sacred, mythic and historical story. What's really interesting and really bad is that in addition to the show, the producer set up what he thought of as like an indigenous village. So this is what George Boodinger meant by Indian encampment. He set up a little village where all the people that he had brought from New York were supposed to live for the summer while he was putting on the show. And the white residents of Shaker Heights and Cleveland Heights and surrounding areas could walk through the village and see indigenous people basically put on display, like in a museum or a zoo. And George Boodinger remembered this because he saw a young boy with a runny nose, and he was shocked because he didn't think that indigenous people could get sick, and he didn't think that indigenous people could experience negative effects from cold weather or rain. The reason that this story got told during the water symposium is that George Boodinger remembered that it was often hard to hear the play because of the chorus of bullfrogs, which were so loud back when there were bullfrogs in the lake before the mid 20th century, when animal life started to really suffer in the lake for a lot of environmental reasons that I won't get into, but you can read more about in the exhibit in the section called Water Quality. What's also interesting is that after this pageant, the Hiawatha legend continued to be sort of part of Shaker Heights memory. This is a program that I found in our collections from a supposed reenactment of the story of Hiawatha at Sussex School in 1926. And it looks like these children would have put on probably pretty caricaturized depictions of indigenous rituals and dances and music. There's also the gender historian in me notes sort of the gendered roles that the children played. For example, in part 1, which is supposed to be the dramatization of the childhood of Hiawatha, the boys played indigenous people and birds, and the girls played flowers and a rainbow. But this was actually just one of many materials in the file cabinet devoted to the history of Shaker schools that really struck me. Another piece that got included in the exhibit was this photo from a 1934 project at Lomond School that was called the Indian Pioneer Exhibit, where students created art projects that were supposed to emblemize early indigenous and white pioneer life, which again, probably a caricature and definitely a generalization. I mean, from this image and the other images, it looks like Southwest indigenous culture was prioritized in this exhibit. But you can find the other photos from this event in 1934 on the Indigenous History section of the exhibit. One thing that didn't fit in, so I didn't share, but I'm going to share here, is this photo, also from Lomond School in 1938, that was captioned "Masked Chinese Play." And it shows this collection of Lomond students in yellow face to put on this play. Couldn't tell you what it was about, but it was called The Chinese Play. It looks to be depicting a royal court of some kind. So these materials together in the same section of our collections, in the Shaker Schools section, really helped me understand the role of Shaker schools and schools in general in sort of creating these racist images that were really pertinent to Horseshoe Lake in the case of Indigenous people, but also we can see that extended more broadly. And a lot of the issues that we still feel lingering today in Shaker Heights and throughout the country, we can see visually put on display in these items that are in the Shaker Historical Society collections. Another piece that really struck me was this letter sent by Mrs. Lawrence McLean, I don't know her first name, to Pearl Masheter, who was the director of highways for the state of Ohio, about the Clark and Lee freeways in 1960s. In the 1960s, Albert Porter, who was the head engineer for Cuyahoga County, set out a proposal to create a connecting system of freeways throughout the county that he hoped would improve commuter traffic and help people get into the city for work, which is a plan that really shows you what was going on in the 60s with white flight and suburbanization as white urban residents began to move further outside of the city throughout the country, and especially throughout the Midwest and the industrial Rust Belt. And in this letter, which is one of many, many, many letters that we have in our collections from the letter writing campaign against the Clark Freeway, which would have ran along Shaker Boulevard, and it would have destroyed part of Lower Lake and all of Horseshoe Lake. In this letter, Mrs. McLean says, "It took our ancestors many years to build Shaker Heights into the lovely suburb it is today. I would hate to think we have reached the point where it is more important to have booming highways than it is to have beautiful lakes, parks, and homes. These freeways, we are told, will save us 5 to 10 minutes in driving downtown. What is our hurry? This is a tremendous sacrifice to ask of us for the sake of 5 or 10 minutes. Besides, if these freeways go through, we shall have to move further out into suburbia, and in effect, it will take us 10 minutes longer than it originally did. This is not progress, this is stupidity. If a freeway is so necessary, and no one yet has heard a good argument that it is necessary, why not clear out the slums to build it and kill 2 birds with 1 stone? But for goodness sake, let's not destroy one of Cleveland's finest suburbs." And when I read that for the first time, I had to sit with it for a while. This language obviously isn't surprising, but it's still a lot to take in, and sort of understanding the way that residents of Shaker Heights really explicitly felt that their homes and their livelihoods and their actual physical lives were worth so much more than the homes and the lives of poor, predominantly Black people in Cleveland communities. So like I said, that was a lot. And this is not to say that I would have supported the Clark Freeway. I, in fact, am very pro public transit, not pro freeway. But I think it's important for us to recognize the way that inequality and racism and violent language really permeated these important campaigns to save Shaker Heights. There were also many Shaker Heights residents who proposed building the freeway as like a barrier between Shaker Heights and Black communities in Cleveland, which has a lot of historical reality, because a whole lot of urban Black communities have been destroyed by freeways throughout the US. And so seeing this this personal account of that that phenomenon was really striking. And like I said, it took me out for a little while in the archive. Another example of something I came across in the archive that I had to sit with that made me emotional was a collection of letters that were written by sisters in the North Union Shaker colony in its dying days, that were mostly expressing deep hurt over the way that other sisters were talking to them, specifically the way that other sisters thought about how they did household chores and how no one seemed to think that anyone else did the chores right. And I can understand this. Just over the weekend, my mom and I were talking about how we cannot agree how to load the dishwasher or the conveyor belt at the grocery store. But these women were expressing a real sense of hopelessness and worthlessness at the way that they were being treated by the other sisters. And so this was also something that I had to sit with. This had nothing to do with Horseshoe Lake and didn't make it into the exhibit, but because it stuck with me, I wanted to share it here. So for an example, a letter written in 1885 by an unknown sender to someone named Eldris C. So probably a sister in a different Shaker colony. This sender said that she felt lonesome and homesick. She felt that she didn't have a home and she was only staying with the Shakers, not living with them. If one has deep sorrows, she said, is it best to always keep it to oneself? Is it right for elders to talk to people, and that too when they are conscientious and trying to do their very best, as though they were dishonest, indolent, untidy, unkind, and selfish, and many other things, and slander them? And this writer goes on to say that she doesn't want to burden Eldris C. with her problems, but she just feels like she can't take it anymore. It makes her sick. And in the context of thinking about why the Shaker colony ended, most historians attribute that to inability to compete with industry in Cleveland. It had been at this point more than a decade since the woolen mill that was the whole point of Horseshoe Lake had been out of commission. But there's also these realities of these women in the colonies who also were just so miserable. And without their work, the colony couldn't sustain itself. And so even though this didn't make it into the exhibit, I really did want to share some of these letters in the exhibit, not in the exhibit, in this talk today, just because the theme in them is that no one was listening to these women or cared about them. And so I wanted to give us a chance to listen to them. And when I talked at the beginning about how I love working in archives, that's really what I meant. I love sitting with marginalized people and hurt people in archival documents and listening to people who were never listened to. And so that was the real sort of emotional work that accompanied the intellectual work of going through the archives and figuring out the best way to communicate information about the history of Horseshoe Lake and curate an exhibit. One other interesting thing that I want to share that also didn't make it into the exhibit was this letter written by Jemima Adeline Mousseau in 1934 to Charlotte Pilot, who had grown up with the Shakers. This letter was written after The Plain Dealer published a story about Charlotte Pilot and her sisters and the experience of growing up with the Shakers in 1934, so about 40 to 50 years after the end of the colony. And Jemima Adeline Mousseau identifies herself as an Indigenous child, or she was an Indigenous child who was stolen, she says, and brought one dark night to the Shaker village. And she has really fond memories of the Pilot sisters, which is why she wants to reach out to them after seeing this article in The Plain Dealer. Jemima identifies herself as part of the Manamani Nation, which is not the name of a currently or at this time active nation in the United States. My best guess is that she meant Menominee, which is a nation in Wisconsin. So it sounds like she was stolen from her home somewhere in Wisconsin and brought all the way to Ohio. There are two interpretations of what she says here. One interpretation is that she was stolen by Shakers and brought to their village. The other interpretation is that she was stolen by someone else who later decided they didn't want to keep her, and then brought her to the Shaker village, which is, I think, the much more likely explanation. Not that I want to erase the possibility that Shakers may have committed violence, and this is something also that I address in the exhibit. But Shakers were known for taking in orphans and abandoned children and families who had lost fathers. And so I think this makes more sense. Jemima also asks Charlotte Pilot to tell her when she came to the settlement and when she left, because she wants to write a book. She says that a newspaper man tried to get her life story, but she wanted to write a book if her daughter ever left government service. She doesn't seem to have ever written a book. And part of me wishes she had given her life story to the newspaper man, because obviously there was a lot going on that we don't know from this letter, but I also really appreciate that she wanted to hang on to her agency and tell her story the way that she wanted to. So after all of that, I'm gonna wrap up talking about archival materials on a lighthearted note. If anyone came to the nature walk that I did at Horseshoe Lake over the summer, you know this story, but the story of Ponto the dog is probably my favorite thing that I found in the collections this summer, and so I am going to share it. So George Budinger, who we talked about before, his family, his mother, him, his sister, his other siblings, lived with the Shakers. His sister Louise Budinger did an oral history. She was living in Florida and basically told her story into tapes and sent them back to Frank Myers, who was working at the Shaker Historical Society and also had grown up with the Shakers and in early Warrensville. And so Louise was telling the story and she mentioned the family dog, Ponto. When Ponto was a puppy, he apparently was extraordinarily mischievous, ate everything that he came into contact with. And one day he ate Louise's straw hat, brand new straw hat. And this was the last straw for their mother. She was not having it anymore. She could not deal with Ponto's antics. And so she told George to take Ponto to Horseshoe Lake and drown him there. And George was not happy, but he did listen to his mother, and he brought Ponto to the lake and he dropped him in. But this is the good part. By the time George got home, Ponto was already there. He had gotten himself out of Horseshoe Lake and gotten himself back home. And apparently he looked so wet and miserable and bedraggled that their mother took pity, and Ponto was able to stay and grow up with the Budingers. So life in the archives is not only just going through countless pages until you find something that is shocking and emotionally resonant. It's also fun things like this that I think really help give life to the history of Horseshoe Lake. So you can read more from Louise Budinger's oral history as well as George's oral histories in the section on the Center family at North Union in the exhibit, where we look at a few oral histories because those are the main sources that we have for understanding life in the Center family and the context where these people were living and working, the context in which they wanted to build the woolen mill. and dam Horseshoe Lake, and understanding how they used Horseshoe Lake not only for industry, but also for recreation, like we do today, and also for drowning dogs, apparently, except it did not work. Although on a sadder note, a lot of people drowned in Horseshoe Lake over the years. It was a frequent accident for children, especially who were swimming or rafting or boating. So, history of a body of water is always rough. It isn't pretty. But it was really cool for me to spend the summer looking through all of these materials and learning all of these amazing stories, and then getting to put them together into the exhibit with, also actual facts and information and context that make all of these pieces make sense. But my hope is that by sharing these items with you, I have sort of given a sense of why I like working in the archive so much, and why history is so cool, and it's so fun to hear these stories. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen, and we are going to jump into Q&A.
Yes, so if you have any questions for Austen, please send them in the chat so we can see them and Austen can answer. We did get one question during the talk. On the first slide that you showed, Austen, the north side of the lake looks heavily eroded. Have you examined this photo in detail, and are there any indications from your perspective of hydrology?
Yeah, this is a good question. I did learn new things about hydrology this summer. Reading a lot of academic documents and papers written by engineers about Doanbrook watershed. In the case of this photo and early Horseshoe Lake, erosion was absolutely a big problem because the shakers basically took out all of the trees. So I can share this photo again. And so you can see here that the tree line is really quite sparse, at least compared to when you walk around the trails in Horseshoe Lake Park today. And it's woodsy. But the shakers took out a lot of trees to build everything, all of their buildings, and there were lots of them were made from wood. And so they took down a lot of trees and then replaced them with their own trees that they wanted. So like a specific variety of apple tree to form the big apple orchard. And some of that variety of tree you can find now in the backyard at the Shaker Historical Society. They also put in mulberry trees for silkworms to feed on, so they could produce silk. But because all of that tree line that was preventing erosion around the lake got cut down, erosion was a big problem and continued to be a big problem. So in that water symposium, that water quality symposium that I mentioned from 1974, this was a big issue of discussion because dirt, soil was running off the land into the lake. This is a process called eutrophication, where soil runoff into the lake saturates the lake with nutrients, which causes an overabundance of plant life and kills off most animal life. And that's still a problem that we see today in the Shaker Lakes.
Okay. Thank you for sharing. That was useful, some useful scientific information. Another question that we have, just in general, what was the most surprising thing you found while putting together the exhibit?
Let's think. This is a good question. I mean, some of the things that I shared here were really surprising. I'm trying to think of something else. I think I was one thing that was surprising and something I found that kind of tickled me was how with certain newspaper articles or magazine articles in our collections, we had like 40 clippings of the same article, which tells you something about how the Historical Society has always been kind of a community effort, because the way this worked was that everyone got the newspaper in the morning and they would see something in the newspaper that mentioned the Shakers. And they would cut out the clipping and give it to the Historical Society. And so perhaps we should do some culling of the archives, but it's honestly kind of cool to see like in an archive at a really big prestigious institution with, you know, a ton of employees that do nothing but archiving, you probably wouldn't have that. But seeing like which newspaper articles have so many clippings shows you what people thought was relevant and important to preserve. And so I think that was really cool, even if I did occasionally get tired of seeing the same thing over and over and over again.
Yes, that's fair. Yeah, I didn't even know that about the collection. So that's really interesting to know and interesting to hear, and something to keep an eye out as we continue adding things and changing things in the archive and going through other collections and doing other collection surveys. So thank you for sharing. We have a follow-up question to the hydrology question.
Okay.
So is the runoff, the nutrient runoff from the lake, is that part of the reason why the bullfrogs are gone?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, there are all kinds of changes in wildlife. One thing that I didn't mention in the talk earlier is that muskrats used to be very plentiful, and in fact, one time a muskrat burrowed through the dam and drained the entire lake by itself because the dam is an earthen dam and it was able to do that. In terms of aquatic wildlife, I mean, obviously there's a lot of factors at play with increasing industrialization that impacts the air and the soil and the groundwater, as well as the actual lake. And Frank Myers, for example, speaking at the symposium, called the toilet that most dastardly invention, and said that the Shakers would have had a low environmental impact because they didn't use toilets. Flush toilets is what he said. So there are a lot of factors at play going through the 20th century and increasing industrialization, but soil runoff in the lake is a really significant problem that I imagine would have contributed somewhat to the loss of frogs and certainly caused the loss of many fish species.
Okay, great. Thank you for that follow-up. So somebody asked, is it possible to make a list of newspaper articles and other accounts of dam overtopping and breaching through the years? And Austen, before you answer that explicitly, I want to take this second to show you all how to access the actual collections index that Austen created and mentioned at the beginning of their talk. So I'm going to share my screen really quick. So this is publicly accessible. So if you are looking at the Archiving Horseshoe Lake digital exhibit website, and you click on the Archiving Horseshoe Lake tab, you can scroll to the bottom and you can see this white box that says Collection Survey Index. And you can actually, the public has accessible to view the Horseshoe Lake Collection Survey. For you, it'll be in only like view only mode for the public. And you can see all of the things that Austen indexed related to Horseshoe Lake, the Clark Freeway, and preserving Shaker history. So obviously these are not explicit about which items are talking about overtopping of Horseshoe Lake, but you can go through some of the titles and descriptions to see what information, if there is, related to the overtopping. I'll stop sharing now. Austen, do you have more to say on that question?
Yeah, I also got some information regarding dam breaches and failures from like newspaper archives, from the Plain Dealer, specifically from Brianna, who has a folder on Google Drive with a lot of the clippings from these past newspaper articles that go through it. And so we have some records of dam failures from those, from newspapers that aren't actually in our collections, but you can find in the Plain Dealer archives or the Sun Press, which was the local Shaker Heights, Cleveland Heights, etc. newspaper. We also can sort of infer some dam breaches. So there's one Plain Dealer article from 1900 that is about a big storm. And this journalist interviewed some residents of Cleveland Heights who all said that they were really afraid during the storm because they were worried that the upper Shaker Lake, that Horseshoe Lake, would overflow again and cause significant flooding. So like, I don't have a record of what storm and what flood they're talking about, but we know that by the year 1900, Cleveland Heights residents were actively afraid of Horseshoe Lake because during storms it had a history of overflowing.
Okay, that's interesting to hear. Yeah, that even if they didn't necessarily experience it, they knew that it was something that happened with the community and something they had to be concerned about with homes in the area. Does anybody have any other questions? Feel free to send them in the chat now. Does anyone have any questions also related possibly to the Archiving Horseshoe Lake digital exhibit as a whole? Questions about anything you read or saw on there? Oh, we have a bit of a lull if no one has any other questions. I did want to invite all participants that are local to Shaker Heights or able to be local to Shaker Heights to join us on December 11th for our holiday open house. This year, Shaker Historical Society is celebrating 75 years, and we're wrapping up our 75th anniversary with an open house from 3 to 5 p.m. on the 11th. We'll have all sorts of holiday-related crafts, light refreshments, and music performance from the a cappella group, the Nightingales. So it'll be a lovely, lovely afternoon to spend together with some of your neighbors and community members. Something else is we have launched our annual fund campaign. And with that, we are trying to raise money to support us in our next, hopefully 75 years as a museum. So I'm just going to send the link in case you or anyone in your community might be interested in donating to our Diamond Year campaign. You can directly donate online and read more about the Historical Society and our mission and what we're trying to uphold with the funds on that link.
Before we wrap up, Krista,
Yeah.
I also got a question by direct message asking about references for the breaches of the dam. So I want to again invite everyone to click that link in the exhibit and go look at the collection survey that shows the collections index that shows everything that I cataloged from this summer with references to dam breaches. And then we should also be able to go in and look at those stories that we have from the Plain Dealer archive, and I think we can share those. We can share those dates of those articles.
Okay, great. Yeah, we can include maybe that link also in the email to participants that I'll send out once the recording is up in a couple of days to view that collections index as well. So it's all in one email.
That'd be great. There's a lot of information, like I said, that didn't even make it into the exhibit. And there is also a section in the exhibit specifically on the failures of the Horseshoe Lake Dam. And so if that's something that interests you, there's more information in a more put together way than I can do on the spot, available for you to look at it there.
Great. I can let me find that page. I'll send that in the chat. Someone else had a comment that said, thank you, Austen. What an amazing treasure trove of information that you've highlighted. I agree. It's information that has been in our collection, but you really helped unearth and show that information to us all attending and just the community in general through creating the Archiving Horseshoe Lake digital exhibit.
Thank
Um,
you. It was so fun.
yeah, someone asked, will we be able to access the things from the index online, or do we need to come into the museum? So as of right now, everything that has been digitalized is mostly within Austen's exhibit and the Archiving Horseshoe Lake exhibit. If you have specific questions about some of the documents and sources, you can contact us at collections@shakerhistory.org via email. And you might need to come into the museum to view some of the items because not everything is able to be digitalized.
But things that aren't digitized, I did catalog with their location in the archive, so you can go ahead and find them easily. Well,
Great,
easily
yes.
might be a stretch, it's an archive, but they are cataloged.
Awesome. Great. Did you have any other questions on your end? Via direct message? No? All right.
No, nothing else.
Great. We got another one. Was there any reference to some of the recreational use of the lake in the mid to late 20th century? I have recollection of there being paddle boats.
Yeah, so this information also is in the exhibit. There was one significant thing is there used to be a regatta on Horseshoe Lake, a canoe regatta held every summer in the late 20th century with canoe races on the river. That was a great big community event. And we also have some information about the use of Horseshoe Lake Park for recreation in the 1980s, especially not just the regatta, but also information like from the city of Shaker Heights and Cleveland Heights about proper use of Horseshoe Lake Park and intended recreational uses and how to take care of the land. And so that's information that you can see in the exhibit. I think the section is called Horseshoe Lake Park. Yes.
Okay. Yep. I'm just pulling it up now that has especially, I see right at the top, the information from the 1980s.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Send that. Great. All right. Thank you everyone for attending this event, and thank you, Austen, for your presentation. It was super interesting, super great. And if you have any follow-up questions, don't hesitate to contact us, the Shaker Historical Society, via email at shakerhistory@shakerhistory.org. And have a good rest of your night, everyone.
Thank you so
Bye.
much, everyone. Good night.